So anyway, so each month we typically have a speaker who gives us wisdom and expertise in things related to church planting. And today I'm really excited to have Korie Little Edwards on the call. And I'm going to introduce her here and turn it over in a minute. But as we do, I'd love for folks just to put your contact, kind of a little bit about who you are, put your name, location, and church or organization in the chat, just so we kind of know a bit of who's on the call. And then, yeah, I'm really grateful to Dr. Edwards for joining us today. And yeah, let me give you access here, Dr. Edwards, um, to she's going to share her screen in just a minute. But Dr. Edwards teaches sociology at the Ohio State University, as I'm told it's said. Is that correct? Yeah, we have a local pastor here, and the leader of our local clergy gathering is from Ohio, and he always makes a point to state that it is the Ohio State University. And she teaches sociology there with a focus on gender, race, and class. But she's also had a real particular focus lately in multiracial churches and on Black churches. And so she's kind of particularly well versed and equipped to speak to us. She recently, just a couple months ago, had a book come out that's called Estranged Pioneers, and I think she'll say more about that. But there's the link in the chat to the book on Amazon, and I have already read a chunk of that and just appreciated the how relevant that research is to some of the challenges and opportunities that various planters of color face in leading multi-ethnic churches. So I will, I'm going to turn over her. But Korie, anything or there's two Kories on the call. There's Korie Lee, my colleague, but Korie Lee, anything that I've kind of missed that we should mention before we.
No, I think you were trying to drop a link to the Multi-Ethnic Council. It came to me directly, so I'm just going to
Oh, okay.
repost that
I
um, real quickly. But no, I think you summarized the most of everything, and just looking forward to hearing Dr. Edwards. That'll be easy enough. I'm doctor in training. I'm on the way, so I haven't attained. So there's a Dr. Korie, and there's just regular Korie. So that'll make it easy, so we don't
Mhm.
get confused as you refer to Dr. Edwards. So
Yeah.
no, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Len, and thank you, Dr. Edwards. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Yeah. So, yeah, welcome. We'll turn it over to you, Dr. Edmonds.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much for having me here. As Len already, suggested and reviewing my work, this is something of a passion for me, studying racial and ethnic diversity in churches, and how is it that religious organizations, churches in particular, are able to be spaces of justice, to address issues of injustice and be places of the real beloved community. And so my scholarship is fundamentally driven by that desire and call of my life. So I'm glad to be here and I'm excited to share. I'm going to share my screen. And as I said, I have a PowerPoint here. And how I will proceed is I will go through my some slides today. I'll talk about some key points from the book Estranged Pioneers, but then I also want to engage in some conversation with you all. And in part, I'd love to do it in breakout rooms. I think we have, even if it's breakout rooms of 2 or 3, I just think there's some real good opportunity to have conversation in that way, and then we'll come back and talk as a larger group. But I'm going to go ahead and get started because we did get a little bit of a late start today. And I do have some things I want to make sure that I cover with you.
Yes, please.
So today as I mentioned, we're going to talk about, in many ways, many of the key points out of the book, Strange Pioneers, which really focuses on how pastors of color navigate heading racially and ethnically diverse churches. It's based upon a national study called the Religious Leadership and Diversity Project, of which I was principal investigator, and includes over 120 in-depth interviews of pastors of multiracial churches from all four major census regions of the country, north, south, east, west, in major cities. It includes conservative Protestants or evangelicals, of which I know most of you or all of you are, mainline Protestants and Catholics in the study. It disproportionately includes pastors of color, but it also includes majority white pastors. But the book centers the experiences of pastors of color. So as you may have used yourself in some of the framework of many, particularly of evangelical pastors of multiracial churches, but also those who are not, is something, a sentiment like this, which is what one of our pastors said in the interviews. There's something that I like about being in a multicultural church because I believe that heaven is not going to be segregated. And so the Lord's Prayer is really big for me. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. And so how are we living as if we were in heaven? And that means living together and living to understand one another, to accept one another, to affirm each other's gifts, to use all of those gifts for ministry. Now, I point this out because this is, again, many of the ways, this is a similar way or sort of a theme that we see of these pastors, that they're driven by a theological understanding of what church should be. And it should be integrated and it should look like heaven.
Mm.
But of course, when we think about what I want to say is how we actually live in the world, how we navigate the United States of America, that the US continues to be a highly racialized and highly racially segregated country, and even more so, religious organizations, Christian ones in particular, are racially segregated. For sure, over the past few decades, the proportion of multiracial churches has increased, and the proportion of pastors of color who head those churches has increased. Nevertheless, a large majority of Christian churches remain racially segregated. And so the question is then, how is it that people who are people of color, all people, but I'm going to focus on people of color, move from being in racially segregated Christian spaces to multiracial ones? Now, again, people land on a particular theological framework for why they do the work that they do. However, there are some sociological reasons for why people end up doing this. One of them has to do with the Christian polity that they are a part of. That is to say, are they a part of a congregation? That is a part of a congregational polity? And what do I mean by that? By polity, I simply mean, what is the governance structure of the congregation? Is it focused in the congregation where it's a part of, let's say, associated with a denomination, but the denomination does not have any direct say on what goes on in that congregation? It has no control or power over the pastor, that rather the elder board or something equivalent to that, they are the bosses or they are the ones who lead the church with the pastor, right? So in many ways, the pastor is responsible to the church, directly responsible to the church. And in fact, what I really appreciate about many of the people who are not evangelical is that really has important implications, because that means that in many ways, in some ways, the church is the boss of the pastor, even though the pastor is the head of the church. Because the pastor needs people to attend the church, and the pastor needs the money of the people to keep that church going. Those are very real facts. So it's really important for us to talk spiritually, but also talk practically. And then there are Episcopal polities. Those are where our Catholic or mainline Protestants are Episcopal polities. Essentially, that means that they are assigned to those positions by their bishop or their superintendent, right? So they're not hired by the churches. They respond to their bishop or their superintendents. Those are their bosses. that has implications for how they end up in the positions that they're in, right? In the book, I talk about it in greater detail, but I'll just touch upon that right now. But then there's another factor that really matters, and that is they become embedded in white Christendom. How is it that pastors of color end up heading multiracial churches? It's not that they were embedded, it's rarely that they are still a part of a largely Black or a largely Hispanic or a largely Asian church and then jump out into a multiracial church. Usually, a very important step happens. They begin to become embedded in white Christendom, usually in seminary or college. During that time of exposure to white Christendom, that is to say, the white culture around Christianity, the ideas that are coming out of a Western understanding, particularly of Europe and the United States, about Christianity, that begins to impact their understandings of God and Jesus and what the church is, their values about Christianity and what is important. And that is what begins to transform how they think about their call, their ministry. Also, what can happen is they go into seminary, which the large proportion of seminaries in the United States are connected to denominations or religious associations that are largely white. And then they begin to come out of that, and they can be assigned to a congregation that is multiracial or multiethnic if they're a part of an Episcopal polity. So I just want to take a moment to pause right there and see if anybody has any questions. Okay, I will.
I have a quick question, Dr. Edwards. This is Korie Lee. This is fascinating to me. Now, when you say embedded in white Christendom,
Yeah.
are you seeing this as a move from Black, traditional Black, or other ethnic specific movements, denominations, and somehow they intentionally make that move? Is it some type of
Mm,
partnership? Are they being recruited?
great question.
What does that transition look like?
So a lot of this is structural. Great question, Korie. A lot of it is structural. And what do I mean by that? The reality is that we live in our society right now. If you're going to be a pastor, you generally have to get some type of education. All right, that has become a credential. Now, in some sets of Christianity, that's not the case. You don't necessarily have to have a higher education, but it's become increasingly so. And so, because actually the vast majority of seminaries and colleges, the Christian colleges, are largely white, then even if you didn't intend to do that, because if you need that type of credential, you end up getting embedded in white Christendom. The ideas about Christianity you begin to learn are coming out of white Christendom. You are being socialized into white Christendom, and you weren't even necessarily trying to do that. You just ended up doing that because it's structural. There is another institution, and I won't go into this too much because I have so much to cover today. There is another institution where there are seminaries that are not embedded in white Christendom, and that's the Black church. So there are Black controlled seminaries. And none of those experiences emerged in our study. That is to say, we didn't hear of people who were in Black seminary ended up in multiracial churches. What
Okay.
happens is their ideas, they kind of end up in it because that's what's available. And then that has an impact on how they begin to see themselves as Christians, as leaders, and it also has an impact on their resources and their networks. A lot of it's more structural. And then what it sounds like is that what it seems that then their ideas about Christianity change as a result of that socialization.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So what I talk about in my book then is that people of color um, ultimately come to the head racially and ethnically diverse congregations, and they experience what we call becoming estranged pioneers. That is to say, these estranged pioneers are pastors of color who head multiracial churches. But the challenge is that once they begin to go on that journey, they are dismissed, right? Because being a part of a multiracial church is actually not valued by the religious ethno-racial home communities that they come from. That almost all of the pastors in our study were born and raised, but if they were in the church growing up, they were in ethno-racial homogenous communities. That is to say, if they were Hispanic, they grew up in an ethnic Hispanic church. If they were Asian, they grew up in an Asian immigrant church. If they were Black, they grew up in the Black church, right? And so this multiracial church um, life, it's not valued by their home communities, and so they're dismissed, right? We're like, okay, that's your experience, you go do that, and that causes a certain kind of disconnect from their home communities. But then they're also dissed at the same time because they're not included in the white circles as their peers are. And so then they're estranged pioneers because they're dismissed by their home communities. They go and do this work. They take the risk. They build either they try to build a multiracial church by planting it, or they're assigned to a multiracial church because their religious denomination values it. And as a result, they are dissed. They are not afforded the same level of resources that their white peers are, and the level of legitimacy and authority that their white peers do. And so that's where people of color who are heading multiracial churches find themselves. And thus alienation characterizes their journey. So what does the alienating experience look like? Well, we talk about, we have Hispanic American pastors, Asian American pastors, African American pastors in our study. And even though all of them experience alienation in that way, as being dismissed and dissed, it manifests in particular ways given their ethno-racial identity and experience. So for Asian Americans, they experience a sense of ambiguity about their role as an Asian American pastor who's heading a multiracial church. So, for example, here is one pastor who's Asian American. This is what they say, and to sort of illustrate how is it that they experience being an estranged pioneer. And this person says, I mean, there would be times when it would be a real struggle to feel like, man, am I even in the right? I don't know. I'm leading this, but I mean, I think I can do a much more effective job somewhere else among people who are just, again, much more at least racially similar to me. And here's what happened in the past few months that's proven that true. There's been a sense at our church, especially with a lot of the Asian influx, I've been feeling much more at home. It goes on to say, and a lot of it's been tied to my background. I didn't see that at first, but I have a lot of shame just based on who I was. So again, he's talking about being a part of a church. He started this church, he planted this church. He doesn't feel connected to the church he planted. This is quite powerful. He doesn't feel like he's a part of that church until more Asian people come.
Mm.
And then he talks about being in this role. And he says, I feel like this is tied to a lot of shame. And then what is it? The interviewer says, I don't know what that means. And he goes on to say, the difference between guilt and shame, guilt is kind of what you've done is wrong. Shame is who I am is wrong. And that sense of, I didn't realize how deep I had a sense of being Asian was an inferiority. Like it was something I had to dig out from. And even doing church, even doing a diverse church, I realized I like being a part of a diverse church because it makes me feel more significant. It makes me feel I'm doing something different than, because again, remember all the references are the ethno-racial homogenous churches they come from, that different from that. And I'm looking for all these ways to try to be special, trying to take away my shame of what I feel is deficient in me. And just having to come to grips with, no, those are not deficiencies. That's the way God is made. That's the way God has made me. But deep in my psychosis was this feeling of who I am is less. Of course, these are some very powerful and I appreciate very vulnerable words of this pastor, which I'm very grateful that they shared. And by the way, I do want to say I really do honor and appreciate the interviews of these religious leaders with me and my team because of this, the stories they tell and how they're very vulnerable. But it is because of this that we can get a real insight into what it really means, and we can begin to be truthful about what it means to lead these congregations. So that was the experience of, that's an example of how Asian Americans experience being estranged pioneers, that sense of ambiguity about their role. African Americans' experience is a bit different. It's really about authenticity. Are you still authentically Black? And
Mm-hmm.
remember, why that is different is because unlike Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans in this country, there is an institution that is all that is controlled by Black people called the Black Church. So there is a very there's an established understanding of what it means to live into and out of your Christianity. That is wholly um, informed by the Black American experience. And so there's an understanding of what it means to be authentically Black and Christian. And what does it mean then to be an African American pastor who decides to head a multiracial church? And here's an example of one pastor who says this. And so I realized when I started pastoring my first church, I was in between. There were Black folks, some Black pastors, Black church members that seemed like they had an issue because I was in a white church. Oh, he's making more money. He thinks he's all that. But the white church they didn't see me as white. They saw me as Black. So I didn't fit in. So you see, Black people are like, who is this? You're not like us anymore. He grew up in the Black church. He was very connected to the Black church, but then he leaves, not as authentic. But still, right? He says this, I miss worshiping in the Black tradition. There's
Mm-hmm.
something about the Black tradition, the singing, the spirit, the movement, and I miss that. Every other year, I go to a convocation of pastors of Black churches. My soul is set on fire and I get fed. And I come back and I'm ready to go and I'm just rejuvenated. So again, what does that say? That hints at a place of alienation, right? I need to go out of my multiracial church, which I'm leading, which I'm the pastor of, and I need to go to the Black church tradition so that I can get rejuvenated, to go back here and lead again. And then he goes on to say, now I feel I'm comfortable being in a white church, which is kind of interesting. I do want to say it's curious that he's calling it the white church, even though he's heading multiracial churches. Okay, so I do want to highlight that. The framework, that tells you something right there. This just slipped, right? I understand some of these expectations about leadership style, differences about preaching, differences about visitation, what it means to do outreach. So I was comfortable navigating that, you know. It does get tiring because sometimes you just think, is this racist or is this just ignorance? And by that, he's beginning to talk about his interactions with people. Like, what's going on? I don't feel a part, that sense of being dissed. Now, the experience of Hispanic American pastors is also slightly different, right? And oh, this is characterized by more attentions between assimilation. That is to say that the Hispanic American pastors in our study were generally a first generation or 1.5 generation. That and the Asian American pastors were almost all at least second generation. So that's important. So there's this tension of assimilation for the Hispanic American pastors in our study who are heading racially and ethnically diverse churches.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, this tension of wanting to assimilate. And so, for example, one person who's a Hispanic says, instead of don't really identifying with being Hispanic American or particularly whatever their ethnic or national identity is, he says, I'm a pilgrim. I don't because I'm nothing, literally nothing racially, right? So this sort of this sense of this language of I'm not going to identify as that. I'm going to assimilate. I'm going to move toward a downplaying race at all. And that's one of these, this is kind of assimilation language, assimilationist language. And another pastor says this, I hope people see me as a pastor who happens to be Latino, not a Latino who's a pastor, right? I think that one of my gifts is being able to connect with the community. So thinking about what's happening here at the church, I think that this church is a bigger congregation than where I was, right? He goes on to say it's very similar to where I was when I started 8 years ago to the church. And so it was very clear that God was sending me here. So again, wanting people to, he recognizes, they recognize racism, they recognize whiteness, but rather their framing is more assimilationist. I don't want to be seen that way. I don't want that to be my identity. I want people to accept me for other kinds of characteristics. So I just want to pause here. Now I'd like to engage in some type of discussion. about what I just talked about, which is what does it mean to be a pastor of color, how people experience this being an estranged pioneer. So I have a few questions, and I'm hoping, Len, you will be able to put people in two different breakout groups for just a few minutes, 5 minutes to address these questions. And a two would be fine, and I can stay out of it. And so one is how and why is being an estranged pioneer a problem? Are there ways in which this is not a problem? It's one thing to think about. For those who have personally experienced this in one way or another, would you be willing to share? Does anyone have ideas on how to minimize the impact of authenticity checkpoints, that sense of ambiguity, or those tensions dealing with assimilation or tending to need to assimilate? So these are the three questions I just want you to grapple with. And then if you could take a few minutes, Len will put you in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back as a large group to discuss.
I might need to manually assign just so we get the right mix here, but the two Cories
Thank
might
you.
have it together.
No, you can keep me out. I'll stay out.
Okay.
And Len, just like 5 minutes.
Okay.
You're happy to, you can go in and talk in one too. You
Yeah.
want? Okay. Oh, welcome back.
Hi.
I just realized we didn't do introductions of the rest of you.
Oh, myself.
Yeah, we didn't do that. When everybody comes back, I think I will have everyone introduce
Uh,
themselves who I
so,
haven't met.
I was talking Korie Lee. I was just saying that I myself, sometimes I have a friend, white, who's married to black. I would go to their church to be rejuvenated.
Yeah.
So somehow there's something that
Mhm.
I found in that black church once
Mm.
in a while. Oh, this is so uplifting.
Yeah, yeah. Wow. So that's really interesting, right? So what does that say about that particular tradition and what it does for people's souls and all that? Is that everybody, Len?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wonder just really quickly, I'm hoping I can meet and I guess we have, yeah, I guess it's just Yvette.
That.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, all righty. Well, if you all wouldn't mind just sharing your telling me your names. I didn't have a chance to learn who you are.
Shall I start?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Lucine Iskenderian from Armenian background, but I grew up in Cairo, Egypt. So I
Hmm.
was telling Korie, or yeah, in that we had to be together because of the Muslim presence at
Mm.
that time. I mean,
Yeah.
in the late 60s or so.
Mhm.
And so we huddled together, and the Coptic Christians, they were together. We didn't even think to, yeah, to mix. And
Yeah,
so we wanted to protect our ethnicity and faith.
that's
So
right.
it's
Yeah.
so different being here.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Context matters, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Your broader context matters. Thank you. Um, Yvette, maybe if you have anything.
Hi, I'm Yvette Moy. I live in Metro DC. I grew up in Queens, New York, the most diverse county in the United States.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
But I think that what you identified, so my parents were Chinese from Guangdong, which is just west of Hong Kong. And but I agree with what you described as our challenge. As Asian Americans, well, and particularly myself as a woman of Asian American descent, I'm not really taken very seriously. Even though I planted a Hispanic church here in the Metro DC area about 10 years ago.
Okay, well,
Um, yeah. So I graduated from Fuller 2 years ago. Had hoped to get a call to a church, but that's kind of been elusive because the salaries are they're just not there. So more recently, I landed a position as a hospice chaplain, where it's very cross-cultural, and I was hired because I reach Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists,
mm,
everybody.
yeah,
Yeah. So it's not exactly what I thought I'd be doing, but we'll see what happens.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your vulnerability there, and we don't talk much about the intersection of race and gender, but that is a part of it too. Talk about
Mhm.
a little bit in the book. Um, we talk about it some, but for sure that's a part of it, right? That gender is a component that has an impact on pastoral leadership as well.
Yep.
For sharing that. Um, well, thank you all. I hope that you had a robust conversation with your partner during that time. I'm going to continue on, and unless somebody has something they did want to share before I do so. Okay, great. So, as I was mentioning, that the context matters. It's really important to think about what does it mean to be a multiracial church pastor? What does it mean to be a multiracial church pastor or moving toward that in the American context? Because often what people talk about is a call to a particular kind of vocation. And it is a call. We do have spiritual calls. We do have impressions in our souls about what we ought to do. But at the same time, we want to take into account our actual everyday lives and what is it that we are navigating. And so I encourage and we encourage pastors to have what we call a sociological imagination. That is to say, recognizing that your individual experiences are connected to the broader experiences in the broader context in which you are embedded. So let's talk about this when we think about the multiracial church pastor role. So what I'm going to show is this figure here that illustrates this. You have the multiracial church pastor, and the multiracial church pastor themselves has an idea of what it means to be a multiracial church pastor. I mean, you were sort of getting to this a little bit in your discussion of your own story, is that you have an idea, or the pastor has an idea of how they want to live into that role. They have an idea of what the expectations are to fill that role well, to be successful in that role. They have expectations about the resources that will be available to them, and they'll have an expectations about how they will lead. But of course, we've already talked about pastors and the congregations that they're a part of are embedded in other kinds of systems. It's not just up to the pastor. It's not just up to the head clergy about what they will do and how they will do it as they lead. The congregation has a say in what that looks like. People in churches have an idea or have ideas about what the pastor should be doing and how the pastor should be doing things, and that has a direct impact on the pastor. And you heard that in the samples of interviews that I provided you today. The sense of what does it mean for me to lead well is not just about what I think, it's also about what the congregation thinks. But of course, that congregation is embedded in a broader religious community. That could be an Episcopal religious community. It can be a congregational religious community. It could also be that the pastor is embedded in a religious network of other pastors, which really matters because pastors talk to other pastors. And so, what do their peers do and think? How do they understand what it means to lead as a pastor? What happens if they're wanting to connect with pastors who are heading ethno-racial homogenous churches? What do they have to say about how you ought to lead? What do the pastors say who are white, who head largely white congregations? What do they say about how you ought to lead? And that has an impact on pastors. Quite frankly, this structure that I'm outlining has an impact on everybody. In any role that we have ideas about what that role is and how we should fill it, regardless of what your vocation is. But the organizations that you're embedded, they have expectations about it. No matter what that organization is, there are your peers outside of your organization who are doing what you do. They have ideas about how you're supposed to do your work, your job. And so this is a pattern that we see across different vocations, across different roles. But I'm speaking specifically about the multiracial church pastor role because that's what we're talking about here, but it also is important for us to have a lens that allows us to really understand what we're dealing with and how we're trying to navigate this society so that we can do our jobs well. So the religious community matters, but then there are broader considerations outside of the religious community, and that is religion in America. How is religion in America structured? Religion in America is structured on what we colloquially call the separation of church and state. That is to say, Congress cannot have a particular religion. They cannot say that the government should be aligned with a particular religion or not. And what that has meant in America is that religious organizations and those who lead them have to make it happen on their own. That is to say, you're not getting any money from the government. No one has to go to your church. It is completely voluntary. And so what that means is that people can come and go as they please. They don't have to stay there. And if you as a pastor, and this is what's particularly important, if you as a religious leader and you have particular ideas about what you believe is spiritually correct, is scripturally sound, maybe the people in the pews don't agree with you. Maybe the people in the pews who give the most money don't agree with you. And those are very real considerations, right? Because people can get up and leave and take themselves, that is to say their human resources and their money with them, those are very honest, real world implications for how pastors lead. And it takes a good deal of courage to be able to say, I'm going to still preach what I believe I should preach. I'm going to still stand for justice in a space where people may not want to hear what I have to say, because I believe this is scripturally sound, and this is what I believe is in the Bible, even though people may in your pews may resist you. And that is because you can't rely on people staying. They can leave whenever they want. And that is tied to the broader structure of religion in America. And then there is another broader structure that we must pay attention to, and that is race. We live in a society that is highly racialized. Our socio-historical legacy is a legacy of racism and structural racism. It is founded on that, and it has not disappeared. And it continues to structure how we go about doing life and interacting with other people. And that has important implications as well. It has particularly salient implications for pastors of color of multiracial churches. And let me pause and say, that I am particularly talking about multiracial churches where there are white people. And I think often when people talk about a multiracial church, they are often talking about churches that have people of color and white people. You can have a multiracial church where there aren't any white people, of course. But generally, when I hear pastors of color talk about multiracial churches, the idea is that these are churches with white people in them and people of color, at least one group of color. And so that becomes all the more salient when you're a pastor of color trying to head racially and ethnically diverse churches, because then you're bringing in, which what I'll talk about in a second, is how whiteness is a part of the everyday ways in which we do life in America. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions. And so please just jump in.
Yeah. So the statement really, the thing you said about the expectation of a multi-ethnic church to have some white people in it, I think that's so important because some of my experience has been our church has been multi-ethnic um, in a lot of different ways. But it was all people of color. But that a lot of times that does not get included in the conversation. Oh, that's not really multi-ethnic. It's not multi-ethnic until white people are involved, and then you got some people of color. Then it's multi-ethnic, but it can't be multi-ethnic if everyone is people of color. So my question to you is, did you experience it in your research? Were there any pastors that were pastoring, leading multi-ethnic churches that did not include white people in their congregation, or was that did you even have the ability to identify that?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, we did. We did actually. And they tended to be Catholic parishes. Catholic parishes headed by not always, but often headed by white priests. So they tended to be parishes. And so there would be a parish that was Black and Hispanic, for example, or Asian and Black, or Asian and or Asian and Hispanic. And so we did see that, but they were parishes. And so then one example I talk in the book is a priest who is a white priest who's very committed to social justice, really had a high understanding relative to other pastors in the study on issues of racial justice in the US and the race and racialization in the US. But it was really difficult for him to be able to manage the tensions between Black congregants and Hispanic congregants. And what that was is that the church for the Black congregants was a church that used to be, it was a place for them to go to be safe from the broader society. It was a parish that had moved from being a white ethnic parish, I'm not sure if it was Polish or Italian, to being a Black parish because the neighborhood was changing. These are parishes. And then after that, Hispanics were moving in. And actually, some of the tensions were this: one, that Black people felt that there wasn't a safe place for them as Hispanics moved in. But number two, Hispanic immigrants were racist against, or expressed some level, not all, not across the board. There was some level of racism expressed against some of the Black congregants. So he dealt with that tension. So yes, we do see that. It wasn't as common, but it did come up. And when it did, it was in the Catholic parishes.
Great. Thank you.
Mhm.
And also, Korie, I think in your interview with Brian Loritz, you mentioned that you prefer the term multiracial to
Yes,
multi-ethnic, right? To
yeah, I
just say
do.
something about that.
Yeah, I sure can. So I do prefer that I do say, let's talk about multiracial instead of multi-ethnic. I think people say multi-ethnic because they want to get away from, my sense is they want to get away from talking about race. But the reality is when people say multi-ethnic, they're actually, that's not what you mean. So let's talk about what we really mean. You can be multi-ethnic and you can be all Black. It could be Jamaicans, people who were African Americans here for multiple generations. It could be people from Nigeria. That would be a multi-ethnic church, but it's Black. It's all Black. You can have a church that has people who are Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese. That's multi-ethnic, but it's also all Asian. And so when I don't believe that's what we're talking about. And I don't, and then if we aren't talking about that, let's talk about what we're talking about and be honest about it. What we're really talking about is how do we cultivate spaces that are racially diverse in a society that is highly racialized and has a historical legacy of racism and a
Mhm.
continued and perpetual legacy, a contemporary situations of racial segregation and racial oppression. So let's be honest about that, because until we are honest about truth, the truth of it, then we really can't deal with it. And so that's why I say let's talk about being multiracial, not multi-ethnic.
Yeah, yeah, that's helpful.
So I'm going to focus on race for just a minute here, and I think we end at 2? I know, Len, we started late, but I can
Yeah,
go straight through.
if it's
I just
okay to go a little bit longer, if
Yeah,
that,
okay. I'll just go for about I'll go for a few more minutes.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
please.
So what is the impact of what we call white hegemony? So when we talk about race, specifically we're talking about white supremacy,
Mhm.
not just racial categories or racial identity. We're talking about white supremacy. And now there's white supremacy, and we often use the language white supremacy. We think of groups like the KKK, right? That's something very explicit. But white supremacy doesn't have to be explicit. It could also be implicit. It could also be just very structured into the way we do life in a particular society. And so what we found in our study, and I found this in other work, is that white hegemony is at work. And what is white hegemony? White hegemony is a white supremacist system where white dominance and the ideologies, norms, and values that sustain it are taken for granted by whites and people of color. That's really
Mhm. Mhm.
white supremacist system where white dominance and the ideologies, norms, and values that sustain it are taken for granted. That is to say, you don't think about it, you just do it, you don't challenge it, but it's done so by whites and people of color. And this is really important because what we found in our work is that for sure we see examples of white supremacist system manifesting in a variety of ways. One of the ways is that people of color, pastors of color, their authority is not um, perceived as legitimate as that of white pastors. That is
Mhm.
to say, white pastors can be challenged. Well, all pastors experience challenges. All pastors have all kinds of stuff they have to deal with in their churches. So this doesn't mean that white pastors and even white pastors of multiracial churches that it's not stressful and difficult. What we do see though is that their authority is legitimate. That is to say, even
Mhm.
though we challenge you and we don't agree and it's difficult and there are disagreements, they don't experience the same level of challenges to their authority as pastors of color do. And in fact, this is particularly interesting with Catholic priests, which I appreciate. When pastors of color, priests of color talk about even congregants of color not wanting priests of color because they
Mhm.
perceive them as being not as good as white priests.
Hmm.
They're not as valued as white pastors. And so it can be implicit, or it can be explicitly said, and it can be implicitly desired that there's a perception that you just aren't as qualified as the white pastor or priest. And so
Mhm.
those challenges to authority emerge as a result of white supremacy. And again, the multiracial churches are embedded in white Christendom. That's critically important. White multiracial churches are embedded in white Christendom. They are tied to other congregations and that are a part of, and all a part of denominations that are largely controlled by white people. That's really important too. And then another way in which this happens is that not only do the congregants challenge the authority of pastors of color, whether those congregants are white or people of color, but pastors themselves diss themselves. Pastors of color diss themselves as well. They minimize their own ethno-racial heritage. They put down their own ethno-racial heritage. They affirm the Christian ideology and theology of white theologians and white pastors. They use them as their models. Very rarely do they use models of pastors of color for their ministry. And so and in fact, they might even try to hide their identity or their race from other people. So for example, in their marketing, not putting themselves on the website, because they don't want people to associate the church with a pastor of color, because the thought is, well, people won't come. So there's already this internalization of white supremacy that is reinforced in how they go about doing church, the ways in which they embody being a pastor, how they dress, how they speak, how they preach, the structure of the services. In many ways, the multiracial churches they lead don't look that fundamentally different from the churches of largely white churches. There are some differences around the edges for sure, but they're not fundamentally different in critical ways. And so the impact of white hegemony is there. And we go again back to the structure, right? The structure that these churches, the pastors, their churches, the religious communities are all embedded in a broader racialized system. And the pastor is impacted by that racialized system. And that racialized system is structured around white supremacy, white hegemony in particular. So what are some considerations that we might have when we think about white hegemony and some sociological considerations? Well, how does that matter? How does that impact pastors? Well, one of the ways, some practical ways in which this impacts pastors, and I gave you some examples, but some practical ways is that it impacts their capital. And by capital, we mean just those resources that people use to be able to navigate the world and get the things that they want and live in the world in the way that they desire. So one form of capital are those social networks and the social capital that goes with it. What do we simply mean by social capital? Sort of simply, it just means that you have networks and connections with people where important information flows, where you have a sense of mutuality with the other person that you're connected with, and reciprocity. And so people look out for you, you look out for them. Right? You can depend on people, they can depend on you. People consider you a part of their group, you consider them a part of your group. And so information and flows of resources happen rather easily. What happens in white Christendom is that white pastors are far more well networked than pastors of color. And multiracial churches are embedded in white Christendom. And so that privileges white pastors because they are already in a religious tradition that's largely white, that they are already connected very well with people. Even though they're heading a racially diverse church, they're still connected with other pastors in ways that pastors of color are not. Remember, pastors of color grew up largely and came up through ethno-racial homogenous religious communities of their own background. They are leaving those and going to multiracial churches that are embedded in denominations and religious communities, broader religious communities that are largely white. White pastors of multiracial churches do not do that. They stay within their space. They may go over here to a multiracial church, but they're still connected to their buddy Bob, who's a pastor over here of a largely white church, right? So I hope you can see that these are structural considerations. These are largely sociological considerations of how pastors experience leading. Cultural capital. Again, cultural capital is just your understanding of the culture. Is it just natural to you, right? Do you just know how to speak? Do you know how to move? Is it the clothes that you wear, the how you wear your hair, how you hold your body, the music you listen to, the food you eat, right? This is all culture. And when you are very familiar with a particular culture, then when you're a part of that group, it's easy for you. People connect with you. You can flow with people more easily. But if it's not your native culture, right? It's your secondary culture, then that means that you have to navigate that a little bit more differently, right? It doesn't come to you as easily. It's something you had to learn. Now, of course, people of color, because we are in a largely white hegemonic society, we by definition have to learn how to navigate this society. If you're going to leave your neighborhood, if it was largely Black or largely Asian, you're going to leave your church, where all the jobs and things are, then you're going to have to learn the dominant culture. So people of color are bicultural, particularly those who had multiracial churches, and I'll talk about this in a second. But that's not your native culture. And so white people are privileged in that way. But the important thing is that cultural capital has an impact on social capital. That is to say, people's sense of whether or not they consider you to be connected and a part of their group and want to share important things with you, whether that's bits of information, whether that means sponsoring you, making recommendations for you, all of those little things. And I tell people all this, I say this all the time, and more I study this work, and even in my own navigation as a leader, the little things matter a lot. And then, of course, your race has an impact on the social capital, which has an impact on financial capital, right? And so we also find that the connections that you have, if you're not embedded in the community, if people don't see you as part of the community, not that they're pushing against you necessarily, they just don't consider you as in, and that's all it takes, then they're not necessarily going to be willing to give you as much as the next person, right? And that's really important for pastors, right? Because pastors need people to give to the church. So again, these are all very practical ways of understanding just what it means to lead as a minister in the American religious context. And we have to be honest about that if we're going to engage this role well, successfully, and also be healthy, right? Because to not see this and not to embrace it and to not to understand it may lead people begin putting a lot on themselves about, oh, I'm doing this wrong. This is something about me, when in fact it has nothing to do with you. It has so much more to do with the social structure that we are embedded in, and particularly one that is guided by a white hegemonic structure and a religious structure that is wholly voluntary. So I won't ask you to talk about these questions right now because we're running out of time, but a few things I would encourage you to think about is, how has white hegemony impacted you as a pastor? In what ways have you affirmed or reinforced white hegemony in how you present, in your presentation of self, your values and behaviors? Forgive that miswriting there. And then how about in how you lead as a pastor? So think about that. What are the ways in which you have affirmed or reinforced white hegemony? How has that impacted your sense of who you are? To what extent have you moved away from it? And what does that mean? What does that mean for how you lead as a pastor? Now, there are some benefits to being that we actually in the end argue that pastors of color are really the better choices for heading multiracial churches. Yes. That is to say, there are structural limitations that pastors of color experience. And there are structural privileges that white pastors experience that don't have anything to do with them. But because of their what we call racialized multicultural competency, pastors of color, we would say, are really equipped to head multiracial churches, particularly if they're given the resources that they need to do well. Why? Because pastors of color are minimally bicultural. Minimally. Pastors of color have their own culture, their native culture, and they're also very familiar with the dominant culture and how to navigate the dominant culture. That is to say, they know the culture that is needed to be able to interact with people who are not a culture of their own, particularly whites, and they know their own culture. White pastors do not have that. Largely, they will admit that in order what they do to compensate for their lack of biculturalism is that they rely on a peer or somebody in their church who's a person of color to give them intel on how to lead in that way. But it's not, they don't have it, right? So in many ways, people of color fill in the gaps that white pastors have. People of color have experienced racial marginalization and oppression. We have a personal understanding of what that feels like, what that looks like, whether it's in a very explicit way or quite implicit, right? Whether it's through microaggressions or macroaggressions, that we experience that, we understand it, and thus we know what it feels like to navigate it, and we understand the structure of it in a way that white people don't. Largely because white people just don't have to do it, right? It's by the result, it's a byproduct of how society is organized. That white people are privileged, that white people have more opportunity, that they don't have to make excuses ever for their culture and who they are. And in fact, they don't. We talk about that, and they're very honest about why they don't want to do that, and they don't have to in the book. It was actually a bit shocking to us at some level. And then because of these characteristics, pastors of color have an understanding of the U.S. structural racism. And therefore, when you're talking about, and I go back to the point, Len, but what we're really talking about are multiracial churches. And we are talking about building a community of people who are honest and really deal with the truth of racialization and the impact it has on our souls and our dignity as human beings. That's the key of building a multiracial community that's really the beloved community, because you have to be able to understand that and to engage that well through an understanding of how God sees social structure and oppression, and how God sees us as human beings with dignity, that we are all made in the image of God. That is critical. And so we argue that pastors of color have racialized multicultural competency that actually really gives them an advantage to heading multiracial churches. So I will highlight a few more things that pastors of color should remember and keep in mind as you. Yes, this is hard work. It's not easy, but I encourage you to recognize your strategic value and your power. You can be a bridge and you can be a broker. I talked about that social capital and those social networks. The benefit that you have, even though you are an estranged pioneer, you still have the capacity to strengthen those ties to your ethno-racial home community. And we encourage you to take advantage of those networks. You still remain connected to them. Even though it might feel hard when you get a little dissed or dismissed by that community. And it is hard and it doesn't feel good. We encourage you to maintain those bridges, foster those bridges, because actually, because of your particular location in the network, that is to say, you are located in a social network where you connect whites and people of color in ways that other people do not in society, that you actually can broker those relationships. That is to say, you can bring larger groups of people within the body of Christ together in ways that others can't. That takes some work for sure, but it is critical that you maintain and reinforce connections to both communities, that you take advantage of that resource that you have. So I will, and then I'll say this. Your social identity matters, right? And in many ways, talking about being a strange pioneer means that, wow, your identity begins to get shaken a little bit. But remember that identity is group-based, and it is reinforced by the idea of who is in and who is out. And so what we're going to encourage, and what I encourage you to do, is reinforce your identity by getting embedded in social networks and communities that affirm who you are. Right? That if you are a person who's heading a multiracial church, I encourage you to build and strengthen relationships with others who are doing the same. This network that we're talking about right now here is doing that. But continue to strengthen those. Continue to spend time and build those relationships, real authentic community, because you need that. It's important for your sense of who you are. It's important for your sense of your call. And this is in addition to maintaining those relationships with these other communities, your ethno-racial home community, and also the white community that you're also embedded in. So I will leave there. I know that we have started late and we're over time, but I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here, and I'll turn it over to Len.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Edwards. So helpful. I appreciate both kind of your mind and your heart, kind of bringing your whole self into this conversation, not only as an academic, but as a person concerned about the health of the body of Christ and the health of these of planters and leaders of color. So thank you for bringing the passion and conviction and greater clarity, for our own souls and for these broader, both personally and structurally, to that. And yeah, I've taken a lot of notes, and just just reflecting even to like the church that I'm a part of right now. It's a multiracial church. We're doing these cultural narrative groups that just started this last week, where diverse groups of people are sharing their own cultural narrative to kind of locate themselves, and then to hear other people's stories, so that we're recognizing and affirming our, anyway, just so it was good affirmation. Okay, we're leaning into that right now, as a church. So
Yeah. And if I could just add this to Lynn, is that I think that so my discipline is practical theology, and Dr. Edwards, this is such a beautiful bridge, as you talk about bridge and broker, between the academy and the church, that is so needed. I think that practitioners would greatly appreciate this, but it also helps those of us that are wrestling in the academy on how do we influence the theories that are shaping church leaders. It gives us some great theories and ideas and disciplines to integrate into what we're doing. So thank you so much. This is great. I appreciate the presentation.
mhm.
I wish I could like have you to for like a weekend just to pick your brain and all that stuff. And so maybe if I can put you on a retainer sometime, maybe we can do that. But thank you
Wow.
so much. This was great.
Well, you're very welcome. Very glad to be here with you all today.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Yeah, blessings on your work, and it makes me want to just go back again and read your book over, and just glean more of these things, because it's just helpful to hear you frame it and give this big picture frame to it all.
Oh, you're
So great. Well, we're going to take a little webinar break this summer, and then return in the fall. But thanks for joining us, and thank you again, Dr. Edwards. God bless you for your work in the academy and the church, as Korie said.
Yes, absolutely. You're welcome. You all have a wonderful rest of the day and a wonderful summer.
Okay.
God
Bye-bye.
bless you all.
Seeing everyone. Thank you so much.